Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and it's great to be in your neighborhood. It's not the first time I've spoken here, so I see some friends in the audience. And I've been asked to sort of warm up the crowd a little bit, which is really hard to do with planning issues, so I'll give it my best shot, but to be provocative as well as true, I'll start by saying our challenge here in this city to show leadership is to be the vanguard of creating sustainable cities, and in order to do that, among the things you have to do, which seems incredible, is to cut energy and resource consumption by about 90% per capita. So that's a pretty big change, but any city or neighborhood or government or peoples that really want to help save the world for their kids can't avoid that target. The question that raises, of course, is what kind of city could possibly produce that kind of result, because it's really cities that are causing, not only are they housing us and giving us jobs and great places to live, but they're where all this resource consumption and energy use is coming from, and the consequent greenhouse gases. So what kind of city could possibly produce 90% reduction? Not this kind of city. It's obviously a very provocative example, but Los Angeles is probably where you don't want to go, and that's a place that has a 15% transit share. That's not the worst in America. Places like Phoenix are, but nobody walks and nobody bikes in that kind of a place. And that's just an indicator of the kinds of things that might be wrong with that arrangement. The places that do work are the places that look like this, at least by the indicators of walking, biking, and transit. For example, in Copenhagen, 72% of all transportation moves are by transit, by bike, or walking. An amazing statistic. The walk share is 10%. Astonishingly, the bike share is 26%. Question is, what is the difference really between what we're looking at here and what we're looking at here? Well, I'll try to explain some of that. Another one is Amsterdam, walking and bike transit share, 72%, similar number. Walk share, 4%. Cycling share, an astonishing 48%. Berlin, bike transit share, walking, biking transit share, 70%. Walk share, 30%. Cycling share, 13%. And Zurich, similar numbers. Very high combined public transport and pedestrian and bike, almost 70%. So, but what's the difference here? The ones that seem to work, and I'll use the term planet-saving cities, are flat. They're not pointy. They have an even density of between 15 and 30 dwelling units per acre over large areas, not in small zones, not near transit stations. Medium density over large areas, not high density at transit stops. The wasteful ones are pointy nodes of high intensity surrounded by low density. The unfortunate fact is that some cities that invest a lot in transit and have a few transit stations with high-rises sprouting near them do not perform anywhere near as well as places like Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Berlin. This graph makes it all the more clear. In some ways, walking and biking are more important. In fact, they end up being more important than transit. Or it's probably more fair to say that biking, walking, and transit are part of the same city system. So what's interesting about these statistics is you would imagine intuitively that transit share would be the biggest chunk when you get into sustainable cities. But it turns out that biking and walking are more important. And when you get things operating well, transit becomes a way to extend the walk trip. It becomes ancillary to the walk trip rather than a way to get really quickly from point A to point B. It's an integrated element of walking, biking, and transit, as particularly Amsterdam's situation demonstrates. If you start to look at these cities and study the transit plans and the land use plans, as I've done a little bit, you find out that places like Berlin, if you want to use it as an example, mostly self-contained district connected by a tram, a network more than a hub and spokes. In other words, the transit facilities are evenly distributed rather than enormously concentrated in just one corridor, as is the case with the planning discussion in this city. Amsterdam, similar. It's a network rather than a hub and spokes, dominated by trams. 90% of their transit system is on surface trams, as shown in here. So, you know, the Amsterdam tram, again, point being it's a trip extender. And since the origins and destinations tend to be reasonably close in Amsterdam and most parts of the metropolitan area, it doesn't take you long to get from point A to point B because point A is very close to point B, typically. So it's not really the tram, it's the density stupid. It's the kind of density, flat, even, and simple across large landscapes rather than concentrated in just station areas. This phenomenon of the flat city is demonstrated here in this remarkable chart that shows, and it'll take a moment to explain, this is energy use, this is number of people per hectare, places like Houston, huge energy use, hardly anybody per hectare, places like Hong Kong, very low energy use, 300 people per hectare. In between is every other city on the planet. What's really quite interesting, though, is the point at which horrifying turns into goodness. And it's this sweet spot right in here where the densities, where you get the maximum return on density changes is between 50 and 100 inhabitants per hectare. And I'll show you some pictures of what that density looks like. It's not high-rise densities. And interestingly, this is a bit of a subtlety here, but places like Copenhagen perform way better than they ought to. And again, partly because of the physical characteristics that I've just described. It should be performing at this level based on its density, which is not that high. It's actually on the low side in terms of density. But because it's flat, it performs way better than the curve would indicate. It's what we call in statistics, it's an outrider. Let's put it then closer to home. In this chart, this shows those consumption numbers for greenhouse gas per household in terms of what the physical patterns are that represent those high numbers in this case. So the high number of 6,000 on this chart, which is a number of pounds, it's 6,000 pounds. The outer suburbs, each resident produces that. And our own West End does remarkably better, only 1,500. But note that Kitsilano does almost as good. So I'm not saying that the density of Kitsilano is better in terms of energy performance, but the level of benefit between a density of Kitsilano and a density of a West End is marginal. So what is our plan? Are we making our region flat? No, we're making it very pointy. Our plan for the region, which impacts this neighborhood in ways that you're very familiar with because of the anxiety around planning process, is a function of this general concept here. And here basically is where you are in this world. So it's a very pointy plan that assumes all the action is happening in these regional town centers and around transit stations. And what do these points look like? Well, there's Metrotown, and there's Richmond and Surrey City Center and Coquitlam. They have a characteristic of widely separated towers, and they have a particular form. They tend to become, we're all familiar with Metrotown, and I think that's probably the most obvious example for all of us in terms of what that ends up looking like. But the reality is that our city, or the city of Vancouver, is not pointy. It's inherently a flat city. And it's a flat city because it was organized around the streetcar system, one of the most important arterials for the streetcar system lies right beyond those windows. And the fabric of this neighborhood is a direct consequence of the way the streetcar enhanced and induced a certain kind of flat city development throughout its service area. It produced corridors that had this kind of commercial activity within a 5-minute walking distance of all houses, a variety of house types that is pretty remarkable. In this, what you can see in this photograph is quite a flat context. Unfortunately, I find it unfortunate anyways, the city insists on treating the city as if it's not flat, as if it's these areas that have a hierarchical significance where, you know, Broadway corridor, whatever that means, is important, UBC is important, downtown is important, but all the stuff in between is, you know, a gray area of unimportance, a place that doesn't seem to matter in this diagram, because the trick here of this diagram is we have these important economic development centers. They need to be joined by very rapid transit. It's the opposite of the way Copenhagen operates. The reality of our city, and this is a diagram done by my students a few years ago, is it operates more like this. If you actually look at the transit statistics, if you look at the way transit works, where land use is, understand that against the background of this is a streetcar city, the diagram is more appropriately this than that. And the misconception, at least in my view, and I've said this for years, and I'll continue to say it, the misconception in my view is when you think of the world of your city like this, it makes you do things like this. Our mistakes make us think that it's a good idea to spend $3 billion for 12 kilometers of a transit system, when for the same $3 billion, if you just did a different technology and sacrificed 6 minutes, you could have something quite different, which I'll show you in a minute. But the driver for this is an understanding of our city that assumes that this is the inevitability for our future. So here's the transit loads, SkyTrain lines, the 99B, a bit of a darker line there on the 41st Avenue, an increasingly dark line because of the candle line. And the projection forward is that gets doubled and then tripled as time moves forward into the future. So you see a very different city than the flat city that is the original city emerge as a consequence of that. Because we think this kind of uneven network should be accepted and in fact encouraged. So we encourage high-rises near station areas, right? Because this is what our planning destination is assuming is the right way to go. But what that generates is this. It generates a situation where you get, and Los Angeles is a pretty good example, it's a streetcar city too. So you get the streetcar city fabric still behind the Berlin Wall of this Wilshire corridor. And we can see evidence of this kind of emerging pattern here. So that's what I think is at stake in the city of Vancouver right now. And here you are, kind of ground zero in this phallic-shaped diagram about the way they see the future of the city. So all of the discussion about sustainability, about economic development, we have to get this subway in. Sometimes I think Mayor Roberts is going to get out there with a shovel himself and start digging because it's so important, is because this diagram is accepted as the inevitable future, or the future of the city depends on this happening. And it's supported by some economic analysis, which I find particularly suspect, since none of the data is supported by any methodology that I could figure out. This is a slide from the KPMG report, which was co-sponsored by my university. Thank God I have tenure, right? And the city of Vancouver to support the case for the Broadway subway. And it's supported by the assumption that you're going to have much greater growth than the trend growth imagined only 4 years ago. The blue line is the baseline estimate from the regional growth strategy, which the existing government accepted, and then only 2 years later said, oops, sorry, updated estimate of what's going to happen. So we go from 180,000 jobs population and jobs on the corridor to the presumed 230 to 280, which is a more than a 100% estimate. It's a more than 100% increase in their assumption about growth along the corridor. Therefore, we need a subway because it's going to grow. Well, who says? And what's the level of our democratic control over that? It's a funny number. And the reality is our city looks like this, in this place that many of you call home. And I live in Kitsilano, and I live near Broadway, so I revere that street. These streets are important to us. Broadway is important to me. The reality is our city looks like this. What if we worked with that fabric rather than against it? What if we worked with it rather than imposing a tower subway station form on the city? Is it possible to imagine an alternative? I think it's possible to imagine. Very hard to make it happen given the political circumstances that you're confronted with. Because for the same money as this, if you took the same $3 billion that's dedicated to this subway, which by the way is only going to go to Arbutus, so it's the halfway Broadway subway these days. But the 30-year proposal, most of us will be dead, the 30-year proposal is to do this. And for the same $3 billion for that, you could do something a lot quicker and a lot more extensive. Instead of doing an underground tunnel, you can use a system like this, a tram system. And for the same exact amount of money, and this data is solid, you could have this hypothetical scenario where the whole city you could replicate the original streetcar system and have a zero greenhouse gas tram system supporting a different kind of development, supporting a different level of walking, biking, transit than the one that they're presuming is going to emerge organized around this. One transit element. That's what our future looks like. That's what we get 30 years. We could have had that. We could have that for the same amount of money. In order to demonstrate the capabilities, we did a look at the city with my students in the past. And the detail of this is hard for you to read, so I'll tell you what you're looking at. This is a black and white map of the city of Vancouver, but every place that has colors is where my students painstakingly drew in every little building it would require to move the population of the city from 600,000 to 1.2 million. This is a doubling of the population of the city without adding any additional housing to the downtown. And without, full disclosure, there's maybe 4 towers in this whole plan, but 99.5% of the population in the city, through this exploration, it's demonstrated that it could be managed almost entirely on the arterials with a low-rise and a mid-rise, as well as the kind of gentle densification that we're already seeing in the neighborhoods as they move from 1 dwelling unit to 3. And again, here's this diagram of what it looks like in a way that you can understand and visualize. The kinds of buildings, then, one example along, this example happens to be Arbutus, with building typology that, at least in the eyes of my students, and I will admit myself, is more appropriate and more resilient and more affordable too in terms of construction costs and heating costs and a whole variety of other indicators. And you know, this is the sort of the thing we won't talk about here in this city too, is that, you know, in Christchurch, New Zealand, they had a situation where they said, well, we're never going to get an earthquake, and they built buildings that were no good in earthquakes. What people don't know is the building codes for the high-rises in Christchurch were the same building codes as we use here. They're not protected to completely prevent damage to the building. They're designed to prevent the building from falling down. But in the case of Christchurch, the buildings that they built didn't fall down, but they were uninhabitable, so they all had to be torn down later. So they had to be abandoned afterwards. So the city of Christchurch has decided that they're going to shift direction. Well, talk about you know, the proverbial shutting the barn door after the horses are gone. But, you know, there may be some moment here in this city for us to think about this, at least. Because there they've decided high-rises are going to be a thing of the past. And the city council vision now is for a smaller, shorter, and more green business district. A little late. And, you know, I don't want to scare you, but maybe I do a little bit. You know, this is something that I haven't heard much discussion on relative to the question of what kind of buildings we should create in our city. So I think that's about it for me. So I thank you for your attention. I think we're going to go right to Richard. Thank you.